In that Wednesday night Matthew study, I have worked my way all the way through chapter 20, and we find ourselves in chapter 21. And so I thought I would just make some comments out of Matthew chapter 21 today as part of that study. And just for those of you that haven't been on the ride with us, I invite you to just jump on board, and we'll try and give you some context as to where we are. So I'm also going to put you to work. Normally I would have maybe scriptures up on the screens with slides and give you my outline and all that stuff. I invite you to find a Bible, whether it be in the pew in front of you, or we don't even have pews anymore, whether it be in the chair in front of you, or on a phone or a tablet, or maybe something you brought from home. We're going to be in the book of Matthew chapter 21, as I've said. But we're not going to start there, and I'm going to give you where we're going to start, because it's in the Old Testament. It might take some of you longer to find it. The book of Isaiah chapter 5. So if you have Matthew 21, we'll be there. You can put a finger there. But we're going to start in Isaiah chapter 5. And I'll be doing a fair amount of reading out of two parables today. And I'll be reading out of the NASB. Your version will likely differ slightly, and I think that's a good thing, so we can see some of the differences. Isaiah chapter 5. I'd actually like to start with a love poem, if that's all right. How many people are into love poetry? Any? Oh, really? Early in my marriage, actually early in my relationship with the woman who would become my wife, I was really into love poetry. I don't know if you can remember back to a time when that may have been the case for you. Recently, we found, my wife and I found a canvas bag on the top shelf of our closet, and we didn't remember what was in it. We got it down. It was all the letters that we had written back and forth to each other. Not emails, right? But letters, because this is before, yeah. And we spent the better part of an evening going through these letters. And what seemed to be profound when I first wrote it, by like the fifth or sixth letter, I was just wholly embarrassed and about who I was back then, and the love that was just gushing out of my pen. And I thought I was brilliant, but we burned those letters. Lisa and I are both better for it. Isaiah 5, verse 1. Let me sing now for my well-beloved. This is Isaiah the prophet speaking. Let me sing now for my well-beloved a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. So the question right out of the chute is, who's the beloved? It almost sounds like a Song of Solomon start, right? Vineyards and beloveds. But this is Isaiah talking, and the well-beloved is his God. And he's about to sing a song, a poem, a love poem about that beloved and God's vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around, and he removed its stones, and he planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower in the middle of it. And he hewed out a winepress in it. And he expected it to produce good grapes. But it produced only worthless ones. Or wild ones is another way to say it. The idea here is that God has planted a vineyard. And if you go back in the story of the history of Israel, he's brought his people, he promised the land to Abraham, and he brought his people out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery, and he brought them eventually to that land that he had promised to Abraham, and he planted them there. And then he did everything he could to make that a fertile land for them. Now he's using viticulture language. He's talking about grapes, right, in a vineyard. But he's not really talking about grapes, is he? He's talking about cultivating a people of faith, a covenant people. He brought them into the land and he planted them there. And he did everything possible for that covenant group of people to produce good fruit, righteous fruit. But when he went, what did he find? He expected to find good fruit, good grapes, right? But when he came and inspected his covenant people, Isaiah is saying to his cohorts, he only found worthless ones. My wife and I live on 5 acres, and we call it the farm, but we don't really grow anything. We do have a few trees that we planted years ago that just on their own produce fruit. So it's nothing we do on a yearly basis. And there's one tree in particular. Most of the trees produce a lot of great fruit. We have apple trees that are they're heavy with fruit already, and it's not even time to harvest. But we have one peach tree. Anybody have a peach tree? No? This one peach tree is horrible. I mean, it does not produce fruit, and we just haven't cut it down yet. This year, it has one peach on it. And it is small and shriveled up, and we go out there every day, and we pass by the pear tree and the 2 apple trees, and they're just full. And then this peach tree is just nasty, little fruit, all shriveled up. It may have something to do with our inability to spray for peach leaf curl, which is something that, I'm getting the thumbs up over here. So I will own that. Maybe we haven't done everything possible to make sure that peach tree is fruitful, but when it comes to God's people in his land, God had done everything to ensure that they had everything available to them to produce righteousness, righteous living. And when I say righteousness this morning, the picture we often get in our heads is some internal righteousness, some a good standing before God, and that's certainly a part of the picture. But at the base of the meaning of this word, it's right relationships. God is concerned, first and foremost, about right relationships. If you take a look at the 10 Commandments, it's often split into 2 parts. The first 3 commandments are about right relationships between man and God. And the last section of the 10 Commandments are right relationships, rules among us. How we can get along in God's economy. Does that make sense? So when God came, he expected to see good fruit. Expected to find people getting along in his economy the way he had explained it should happen. And he only found worthless ones. So what's about to happen here? Let's read the love story a little bit more. And now, verse 3, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge with me in my vineyard. This is the voice of God now. So we've slipped out of, it's still Isaiah writing, but we've slipped out of Isaiah's voice, and now it's God speaking. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done with it, or done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now, let me tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. God says, I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. It's a difficult message that Isaiah is giving to his contemporaries. He is saying, you have squandered your opportunity. Israel was always meant to be a shining beacon in the world for the rest of the world to see who God was and what he was like. And God had given them every opportunity to develop that picture here on earth of here, this is what happens when you live as God would have you to live. This is how people get along. This is how society was meant originally to function. And Isaiah's message through this love poem is to let the people know that their time is up. They have messed it up. And God's justice is coming. And how does he do it? Well, he uses every poetic tool in his literary bag. It's a little hard to see sometimes in the English. I've told you it's a love poem, and the way it starts out, it's certainly that. It's the beloved God, and it's his vineyard that he cares for. There's also a bit of wordplay, and there's a parable as well. The whole thing is a parable, and it's a story about God and his vineyard. There's some wordplay that comes up in this next verse, chapter 5, verse 7, that I'm going to share with you that's kind of fun, that we don't get to see in the English. Verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord. So here's the conclusion. What has happened? The Lord has planted a vineyard. He's done everything for it he could. He found worthless grapes. He has pronounced judgment. He's going to take down all the things that he prepared. He's going to let the land go to waste. And here's kind of the key, the legend to the map, let's say. For the vineyard, verse 7, of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. It's God's covenant people. Okay? That's what the vineyard is. And the men of Judah, his delightful plant, the vines. Thus he looked for justice. That's God. When he came, he looked for justice, but behold, what did he find? Bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress. So Isaiah has chosen to use viticulture language, the language of growing grapevines and fruit, and good fruit and bad fruit. But ultimately, here is what God is looking for. He came to look for good fruit, and he expected to find righteousness, people living in right relationships with each other and with God. That's what he expected to find. And what, instead of righteousness, did he find? Just cries of distress. What does it cause people to cry out in distress? It's when things aren't going right. And what is justice? Well, if righteousness is people getting along, when that doesn't go well and people aren't getting along correctly with each other or with God, we expect justice to happen. This is the basis of our society as well. And so he expected to find righteous relationships going on, but when that wasn't there, he also expected to find some justice, some corrective means, so that when the behavior is not right, that justice steps in and corrects that behavior. That's what he expected to find. That is the fruit of the vineyard that God expected to find. Righteousness and justice. But when he came, what did he find? Cries of distress and bloodshed. And this is not at all the picture that God would have for his covenant people. So, there's a bit of the wordplay. Let me just give you, he says, I looked for justice, but I found bloodshed. Those are completely different words in the English, but if you go back to the original Hebrew language, there's only one letter difference between those two words. And so, in this poetic form that he's taken, not only is Isaiah using poetry, love poetry, he's also using the parable, but there's also this wordplay at the end that catches the attention. And if that wasn't enough, he goes to the second line, the last line of verse 7. He looked for righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress. Again, completely different words in our language, but in the original language, he did it again, one letter difference between those two. And so he's using this poetic wordplay. It'd be kind of like me saying, I really struggled to come up with a good example, but here's what it is. It's like saying, after dinner, I went looking for dessert, but all I found was a desert. Does that make sense? How disappointing would that be? One letter difference, but a great contrast between what you expected to find and what you actually ended up finding. And so this ends the part of the letter, the poem out of Isaiah. Interestingly enough, Isaiah was not the only prophet of God to use poetry. I love poetry, actually, and parable to communicate to his people. There was another prophet. We've been following him in our Matthew study for several weeks now. Some 700 years later, a prophet came by the name of Yeshua. Does that sound familiar? It's actually the same Hebrew root as Isaiah. And he came and he spoke to the leaders of God's people of his day as well. Right? And he spoke to them about their mismanagement of God's vineyard. So that kind of introduces the parable that we're going to be in today in Matthew chapter 21. We will eventually work our way down to verse 23, but I'm going to start up because just to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to start up in Matthew 21, verse 12. And Jesus entered the temple. Jesus has made his way to Jerusalem. We're nearing the last week of his life, and he has entered Jerusalem, and he has cleansed the temple. Do you remember the cleansing of the temple where he turned over the money-changing tables and he uprooted the seed of the people selling doves? And Jesus entered the temple, verse 12, Matthew 21:12. Jesus entered the temple and drove out all of those who were buying and selling in the temple, and he overturned the tables. And then there's this, in 18 through 22, there's this story about the barren fig tree that I spoke on, actually, on Palm Sunday when I last preached. I went through the first half of this chapter. And then in verse 23, there's an interesting question, because Jesus has been doing all these things, and he entered the temple again, and the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching. And what are they about to do? Jesus had just upended their lifestyle. He had entered the temple. He had overturned the money tables. And those leaders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" By what authority are you doing these things? Who do you think you are, in other words? You've come into our place. You've done this to our system. Who do you think you are? And it's out of that question that Jesus then goes and asks them a question. He's a good rabbi. He responds to a question with another question. And he puts them in a paradox, a predicament. He asks a question about John the Baptist's ministry. Where did that come from? Was it from God or from man? And they're in a predicament. They can't answer that one without playing their hand totally. And so they refuse to answer. And Jesus then says, "Well, I'm not going to answer you," which is kind of snarky. But interestingly enough, oftentimes we just end right there, but interestingly enough, he follows that statement of "I'm not going to answer you" with 3 parables where he answers them. I don't know if you ever noticed that. And all of the parables are talking about the heart attitude of the people that reject him as Messiah. The question, what's the question? Who gave you the authority to do the things that you're doing? Now, it might just be the temple cleansing. It might be his entire ministry, because he's been upending tradition for the last several years in his public ministry. But the question is, who gave you this authority? What authority do you have? He says, "I'm not going to answer you," but then he says, "I'm going to tell you 3 parables." And the first one is about 2 sons. One that says, "Yeah, I'm going to do the work in the vineyard." And then he ends up not doing it. Another son that says, "No, I'm not going to do the work that you're asking me to do." But then he feels guilty. A conscience gets him, and he goes out into the vineyard and works. And that's a picture of what's going on in the past, the decision that these religious leaders had made in the past. And then we get to this parable of the landowner. We're just going to walk through this fairly quickly. It starts in verse 33, the parable of the landowner. Listen to another parable. Did you hear that? I really want you to listen to this parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a wine press in it, and he built a tower. Do you see it? Did you hear what Jesus just did? It's a quotation out of where? Isaiah 5. Do you think his audience knew that? Yeah, they were very much aware of what Jesus was quoting. Do you think the audience knew the surrounding context of the Isaiah passage that Jesus was quoting? A context of a love song of a heartbroken God who has come to his vineyard, a vineyard that he has cared for, but that is not producing good fruit. That's the context of the Isaiah passage that Jesus quotes here. But Jesus' parable is a little different, because there in Isaiah we're looking at bad fruit, and Jesus ends up looking at bad farmers, right? So let's take a look. Second half of verse 33. And this landowner rented it out to vine growers, rented out the vineyard, and went on a journey. So this is pretty typical. This is an investment property for the landowner, right? It's a rental, and probably fairly typical of property in Jesus' day, actually, because there was a lot of Roman people buying up large pieces of ground. We know this from other extra-biblical records. Large plots of ground were being bought up and owned by Romans who lived way far away, and they would hire tenant farmers to come in and work the land. The key thing here, though, is when the tenant farmer works the land, whose produce is it when the harvest comes in? We might want to say that it's the tenant farmer, but the way the contracts worked is it's the landowners, right? It's the landowners. So we need to remember that as we go through. When the harvest time approached, verse 34, he sent his slaves. This is the landowner. He sent his slaves. My version says slaves, but it's also a servant, okay? Another word used throughout the Old Testament for God's prophets, okay? So let that be a little hint, maybe. The harvest time approached. He sent his servants to the vine growers, the tenant farmers, to receive his produce. And the vine growers took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned the third. So all of a sudden, this parable that seemed rather normal up until this point just took a sharp left turn, did it not? I mean, we did have this normal contractual relationship with a tenant farmer and a landowner, and it's harvest time, and all of a sudden everything's normal that's happening, and there's bloodshed, right? I imagine cries of distress as well. And it escalated rather quickly. Didn't expect that. So this is where, when Jesus is talking, people are probably starting to pay attention. There's a mutiny in the vineyard. Verse 36. Again, he sent another group of slaves. So what does the landowner do when in the first group goes in and is killed? He says, well, there must be some mistake. I must be hearing things. I'm just going to send another convoy. And it's another group of slaves. It's a larger group of servants than the first group. He figures that maybe in numbers they can do what the first group wasn't able to do. I would have sent them with maybe some weapons, right? It doesn't say that that's the case, but he just sends another group of servants. What are they looking to find? What do you expect the harvest to be? Well, it's in the viticulture language, so they're looking for grapes, but I want you to be asking yourselves that question. The vine growers took this larger group, and they did the same thing to them. But afterward, verse 37, afterward he sent his son to them. Now listen to the logic of this. Sent first set of servants, and they were killed. A larger group of servants, and they were killed. And the landowner, the logic going through the landowner's mind is, whatever situation is going on over there in the vineyard, they will respect someone whose inheritance it is to walk in. He is my representative. He is of my blood. I will send my son, and my son will be able to figure this out. But when the vine growers saw the son, they said among themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize the inheritance." Now, again, we take another left turn here because I don't know what kind of a delusion the tenant farmers are under, but maybe the inheritance is a bag of gold that he's traveling with and they just thought they'd take it. But likely, the way this reads, it's the farm, the vineyard is his inheritance. And their thought process is, if we just kill the son, this is eventually going to be his, but if he's not there, it will be ours. And the landowner will just forget about it, I guess. But is that logical? That's not logical at all. And so the tenant farmers are under this delusion that what is not theirs has become their right to own and work. Does that make sense? And it's a complete delusion. I mean, there's nothing good that can come out of this. And it's obvious when Jesus tells the story because he finishes with a question to the people that he's telling it to. Who's he telling it to? The religious leaders of his day that he has come and he is singing this love poem to. A love poem. When the landowner's son comes, what does he find in the vineyard? He hears cries of distress and his own blood shed. Right? It harkens back to the Isaiah passage. There's also a little hint in the back of your worship folder. I have some passages listed. I also have 1 Kings 21. Ahab covets Naboth's vineyard. I'm guessing you haven't read that in your private devotions in the last week. So I'm not only going to mention it here. There's also another story in the Old Testament in 1 Kings 21 about Naboth, a man who owned a vineyard, and Ahab and Jezebel's plot to kill him and take over his vineyard, right? And that is in the background of this story as well, especially when the son comes and they kill him and their intent is to take over. In that illusion, what is happening is Jesus and Matthew, through Jesus' words, is saying, you religious leaders of the day, Jesus' day, you are as bad as Ahab and Jezebel, another group of people that led Israel for a time that were wicked. The only contrast is what? If you go back and read that story, Ahab relented for a bit after this event. He actually relented. And in contrast to that, the religious leaders of Jesus' day do not relent. They do not hear the teaching and say, we're in the wrong. So, verse 40. Therefore, the owner of the vineyard comes. When the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? Verse 40. This is the question that Jesus poses to the religious leaders. And it's interesting their response. He will bring those wretches to a wretched end. Who are they speaking of, by the way? They're talking about themselves, but they don't know it. This is sort of that joke where somebody's making fun of you, and you finally figure it out eventually, because they do, but it's like 30 seconds too late. Has that ever happened to you? So they're saying, oh yes, bring them to their wretched end. And he will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at proper seasons. Right? And Jesus goes into another poem that we won't look at. But when the chief priests, verse 45, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them, and they sought to seize him. So let's kind of just go through the cast of characters in Jesus' love poem as we get ready to conclude. What's the vineyard? Yeah, it's Israel, but more than Israel, I want you to be thinking of it as the covenant people of God, okay? Those people of God, because Jesus is here to change that picture slightly. Away from a people group and a land mass per se, but to more of a living temple with living stones. That's the message of the New Testament. And it's going to be people centered in faith in Him. And it's going to be spread out throughout the world. So it's not going to be as much focus on Israel, the land Israel, but it will still be covenant people, of which most of them in this first portion of his ministry were all Jewish, by the way. So the vineyard, the house of Israel, or God's covenant people. Who's the landowner? This is easy, hopefully. God. The servants and slaves, I kind of gave that to you. Prophets from the Old Testament that had come to kind of collect the harvest and had been killed. Several of the prophets had been killed in the Old Testament. Who's the Son? Good. He's the very embodiment of God, Jesus. And the purpose is to answer the original question. Do you remember the original question as we close? Matthew 21:23, by what authority are you doing these things? Are you cleansing the temple? Are you making corrective actions? Are you bringing justice where righteousness does not exist, in other words? By what authority are you doing this? And Jesus does answer this in the end. He certainly does. And what I want to give you the picture of as we close is we're not just focusing on a small mass, but in Jesus' economy, in his temple ministry, the temple becomes an outpouring to the whole world. I would just invite you to flip over to Matthew 28, verse 18, as we get ready to close. Jesus has been given, after his death, burial, resurrection, he's been given all authority on heaven and earth to go about his ministry. Jesus came up and spoke to them, verse 18. Actually, I'm in the wrong, just a second. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, verse 18, 28. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, teaching them to observe the commandments. So, I think here's the hesitancy. How can we bring this in like a 1-minute summary? How can we bring this into today and have something? Because I'm not an Israelite religious leader that Jesus originally gave this to, right? I don't even live in that land. I am here in my time, and that's where we find ourselves. And so the question really is, what is the circumstance that could speak to us today? And I think we have a temptation, much like the religious leaders of his day, we have a temptation to claim things as our own. It's really delusional thinking. When we have come into the vineyard and agreed to work in God's vineyard, right? And agreed to the terms of a contract, a covenant, for us to then start thinking that this is maybe our vineyard. This is my this is my life. This is my paycheck that I can decide what to do with, right? This is my space that I get to decide how I use it. This is my family. I think that is the line of reasoning that we need to be very careful of, even in God's new covenant economy. Because it's when we start thinking delusionally like that, when I start thinking about myself first and not other people first, what happens? Righteousness does not exist. Right relationships between us does not exist if I'm thinking about myself first. Does that make sense? And what also goes south? The relationship I have with God doesn't exist. And then we also might not invite justice, the corrective action that would make things righteous again. We lose that in our community. So that's the thing that I think we need to be very careful of. Jesus has been given all authority to run the vineyard. And he says, when you get it down, when you enter into covenant relationship with me and agree to work in the vineyard, here's what I want you to do. I want you to teach other people what I have commanded you to do. And I want you to go and make disciples. That's what you are to do. Produce fruit of righteousness.